I was 23 years old when I learned that silence could be mistaken for consent, and that the inheritance meant for my hands would pass instead to my cousins, simply because hers were deemed more worthy of holding it. The morning my uncle's will was read. Rain fell against the library windows in sheets that blurred the garden beyond into watercolor. I sat in the chair farthest from the fire, my black mourning dress absorbing what little warmth reached that corner of the room. The solicitor's voice droned through phrases I had heard before in other rooms, at other readings. My cousin Beatrice sat nearest the mahogany desk, her posture suggesting she already knew what the papers contained. Her husband stood behind her chair, one hand resting on her shoulder, with the casual possession of a man who has never questioned his right to touch what he desires. My uncle had raised me. When my parents died of scarlet fever before my 5th birthday, he brought me to Thornfield House and gave me the childhood bedroom that overlooked the rose garden my mother had planted. For 18 years, I had managed his household accounts, nursed him through 2 winters of illness, read to him each evening from books he could no longer see clearly. I knew every servant by name, every tenant's family, every field that needed draining. I had believed, in the way one believes the sun will rise, that he understood what I had given. The solicitor cleared his throat. Thornfield House, with its 800 acres and all furnishings therein, would pass to Mrs. Beatrice Ashford, née Thornfield, my uncle's only living nephew's wife. There were provisions for the staff, small annuities for long service. My name appeared once near the end, attached to a sum of £200 and the contents of my mother's jewellery box. Beatrice did not look at me when she rose to accept the documents. Her silk rustled in the silence like an accusation. I watched her gloved fingers close around papers that would make her mistress of every room I had dusted, every garden I had planned, every memory I had preserved. The solicitor was already gathering his case when she spoke. "Of course, Eleanor will be welcome to remain," she said, her voice carrying the particular kindness of those who have just taken everything. "As long as she finds the arrangement suitable." I understood then what suitable meant. I would become the useful relation, the unmarried cousin who managed the still room and mended the household linen. I would fade into the wallpaper pattern, visible only when needed, compensated by the roof above my head and the charity of a woman who had visited Thornfield 3 times before my uncle's death. That night, alone in what would soon cease to be my room, I found my mother's letters. They had been kept in a rosewood box, tied with ribbon that had faded from blue to grey. I had read them before, as a girl, learning the shape of her handwriting before I could fully understand her words. Now I read them as a woman who recognised the weight of what is written and witnessed. The 3rd letter from the bottom changed everything. It was addressed to my uncle, written a month before my mother's death. The ink had faded to sepia, but the words were clear. She wrote of her wishes for her daughter, of her hope that I would be educated as a gentleman's daughter should be, given opportunity and independence. She wrote of Thornfield, how she and her brother had explored every corner of it as children, how she had always imagined I would know the same freedom. And then, carefully, deliberately, she wrote of the promise he had made to her when she married my father, the promise that if anything should happen to her, I would inherit her portion of their family's estate, would be provided for as her parents had intended. There was a reply beneath it, in my uncle's hand, formal and binding. He confirmed the arrangement. He outlined the terms. He gave his word as a gentleman and affixed his signature with a seal. I held the letters until the candle burned low, until the wax pooled and hardened in shapes that looked like tears. Then I folded them carefully and placed them in my reticule, where they rested against my heart like a knife waiting to be drawn. The first month of Beatrice's reign at Thornfield, I was quiet. I took my meals in the small parlour when invited, helped inventory the china she wished to replace, offered suggestions about the spring planting that were received with the patient condescension one might show a child who believes she understands adult matters. I watched her husband examine the account books with the confidence of a man who has married into property and sees no reason to question his good fortune. I observed how quickly the servants learned her preferences, how thoroughly my 18 years of care were erased by her 8 weeks of authority. I became a student of my own invisibility. I learned which rooms Beatrice preferred, which hours she kept, which topics made her expansive and which made her irritable. I understood that she feared being seen as grasping, that she told everyone my uncle had made his choice freely, that she had been as surprised as anyone by his generosity. She wore the fiction of her humility like the pearls at her throat, both inherited and assumed to be rightfully hers. In the second month, I began my preparations with the care of a woman setting a table for guests who do not yet know they are invited. I wrote first to my uncle's solicitor, requesting a private meeting in his London office. The letter was brief, professional, and entirely unmemorable. Then I wrote to 3 other solicitors, men whose names I had learned from newspapers and whose reputations suggested they understood that wills could be challenged when promises had been made and broken. I travelled to London on a Tuesday, telling the housekeeper I was visiting a school friend in Bloomsbury. The solicitor's office smelled of leather and pipe smoke, and the man who received me had the tired eyes of someone who has witnessed the full range of human disappointment. I presented my mother's letters. I explained the circumstances. I asked whether a promise made to a dying sister, confirmed in writing, might constitute grounds for contesting a will that contradicted it. He read the letters twice, asked 3 questions about dates and witnesses, and then leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who has just recognised an interesting puzzle. Mrs. Ashford will argue that these are merely informal correspondence, he said, that your uncle's later will supersede any previous arrangement. And if there were other documents, I asked. Other evidence of his intentions. He studied me for a long moment. Then we might have a case worth pursuing. But understand, Miss Thornfield, that such a suit will not be brief, will not be inexpensive, and will certainly not be private. Your cousin will defend her inheritance vigorously. I understand, I said. I want only what my mother intended for me. I returned to Thornfield that evening and went directly to my uncle's study, which Beatrice's husband had claimed as his own. The desk where I had helped my uncle write letters for 20 years now held another man's papers, another man's cigars, another man's casual disorder. But beneath the desk, hidden behind a panel I had discovered as a child, was a space my uncle had used for documents he wished to keep secure. I worked by moonlight, my fingers remembering the catch that released the panel. Inside were deeds, certificates, letters of credit. And there, wrapped in oilcloth, was a document dated 3 years before my uncle's death. A codicil to his will, written in his own hand, leaving Thornfield House and all his personal property to his beloved niece, Eleanor Thornfield, in fulfilment of the promise made to his late sister. It was unsigned, unwitnessed, legally worthless, but it existed, and it proved that he had intended what my mother had believed. I photographed it the next day using the camera kept in the morning room, the one Beatrice had not yet bothered to examine or claim. I returned the original to its hiding place and kept the photograph with my mother's letters, 3 pieces of paper that together told a story of intention, promise, and theft. The 3rd month, I planted my garden. Not in soil, but in drawing rooms and afternoon calls, in carefully chosen words, dropped like seeds in conversations I appeared to join by accident. I attended church faithfully, where the vicar's wife mentioned how devoted I had been to my uncle in his final years. I volunteered at the charity school, where the headmistress recalled my mother's kindness and remarked how like her I was. I accepted invitations to tea with families who had known my grandparents, where I listened more than I spoke, and allowed my presence to remind them of histories Beatrice could not claim. I became visible again, but differently. No longer the useful relation, but the overlooked daughter, the rightful heir transformed into a dependent. The story wrote itself in the spaces between what people said and what they remembered. No one could quite explain why it seemed wrong that Beatrice should have Thornfield, but the discomfort grew like mould in damp corners, quiet but persistent. In the 4th month, I filed my suit. The petition was delivered to Beatrice on a Tuesday morning, while she was planning the menu for a dinner party she hoped would establish her position in the county society. I was in the garden when I heard her scream, a sound of pure outrage that carried through the open windows and scattered the birds from the cherry trees. She found me among the roses, my mother's roses, the ones I had pruned each spring and protected each winter. Her face was flushed, her hands shaking with fury barely contained by breeding. "How dare you?" she said, her voice low and venomous. "After everything we have done for you, after we opened our home to you." "Your home," I said quietly, not looking up from the rose I was examining for aphids. I have been wondering about that phrase. How a place becomes yours simply by being given what belonged to someone else. The will was clear. The will was recent, I interrupted, finally meeting her eyes. My mother's letters were older. My uncle's promise was given before you even met your husband. I am simply asking the court to determine which commitment should be honoured. "You will lose," she said, her chin lifting. "No court will overturn a properly executed will on the basis of old letters and the fantasies of a disappointed spinster." "Perhaps," I said. "But they will hear the case, and everyone will learn exactly how you came to inherit a house from a man whose niece nursed him for 18 years while you paid 3 courtesy calls. Everyone will understand precisely what your claim is built upon." I watched the calculation move across her face as she understood what I had done. The suit itself might fail, probably would fail, but the scandal would succeed beautifully. Every detail would be examined in open court. Every witness would testify to my years of devotion and her convenient absence. Every document would be read aloud in rooms where reputation mattered more than law. She could win the case and lose everything that made winning worthwhile. "What do you want?" she asked, finally. "What was promised to me," I said. "What my mother believed I would receive. What your husband now enjoys as if he had earned it." The trial was set for October, a date that gave us both 5 months to prepare our cases and consider our positions. During those months, I lived at Thornfield as a guest, in rooms that felt increasingly like a museum of my own dispossession. Beatrice no longer spoke to me at meals. Her husband watched me with the frustrated anger of a man who has been made to feel uncertain about something he thought was settled. But I was not alone. The servants, who had known me since childhood, maintained a careful neutrality that somehow felt like alliance. The tenants, when they came to pay their rents, asked after my health with a warmth they did not extend to Beatrice. The county families, who might have shunned a grasping relation trying to overturn a will, instead began to whisper about justice and promises and the peculiar cruelty of leaving everything to a nephew's wife while giving nothing to the niece who had sacrificed her youth to duty. In August, 3 months before the trial, Beatrice's solicitor requested a meeting with mine. They met in a London office far from both Thornfield and the courts, in a room designed for the quiet resolution of matters that should never become public. The offer was presented to me on a Wednesday afternoon. I would receive a settlement of £5,000 and a cottage on the estate, small but sufficient, with a garden and independence. The suit would be withdrawn with prejudice, preventing any future claims. Beatrice would retain Thornfield, and we would both sign documents ensuring our mutual silence about the circumstances. I considered it for exactly as long as it took to read the terms. Then I declined. "Tell Mrs. Ashford," I said to my solicitor, "that I will see her in court." The trial began on a morning when frost silvered the grass and the courtroom smelled of damp wool and nervous sweat. The gallery was full of people I recognised, neighbours and tenants, and county families who had come to watch justice become entertainment. Beatrice wore black silk and a hat with a veil, the costume of injured dignity. I wore grey wool and my mother's cameo, the uniform of patient truth. My solicitor presented the letters first, reading them aloud in a voice that made promises sound like prophecies. He called witnesses who testified to my uncle's affection for me, his pride in my capabilities, his frequent statements that I was like a daughter to him. He produced the photograph of the unsigned codicil, arguing that it demonstrated intent even if it lacked legal force. Beatrice's solicitor countered with the will itself, properly signed and witnessed, executed when my uncle was of sound mind and clear purpose. He suggested that sentiment was not the same as obligation, that a man might love his niece while choosing to leave his property to his nephew's wife, that informal promises made to a dying sister 20 years ago could not override the formal decisions of a man's final years. The trial lasted 3 days. On the afternoon of the third day, after both sides had rested and the judge had retired to consider his decision, I sat in the courtroom and felt the weight of what I had done settle around me like a cloak. Win or lose, I had forced the truth into light. I had made visible what everyone had preferred to ignore. I had refused to disappear. The judge returned at 4 o'clock. His face revealed nothing as he arranged his papers, adjusted his spectacles, cleared his throat. The courtroom fell silent with the particular stillness that precedes revelation. "I have considered the evidence presented by both parties," he began, his voice carrying the flat authority of law. "The will executed by the late Mr. Thornfield is valid in form and clear in intention. However, the court must also consider whether that will represent the totality of the deceased's obligations." I felt my solicitor's hand tighten on the table between us. The letters submitted by the petitioner, combined with testimony regarding Mr. Thornfield's statements and behaviour, suggest a promise made and reinforced over many years. While such promises do not automatically override a will, they do create what the law recognises as a moral obligation, particularly when the promisee acted in reliance upon those promises. Beatrice made a small sound, quickly stifled. The court finds that Miss Eleanor Thornfield did, in fact, structure her life around the reasonable expectation of inheriting Thornfield House. She declined opportunities for marriage and independent establishment, devoted herself to her uncle's care, and managed his property with the understanding that she was preserving her own future. Mrs. Ashford, by contrast, had no such relationship with the deceased, and no basis for expecting his bequest beyond the general custom of leaving property to male heirs or their wives. The judge paused, looking directly at me. Therefore, while I cannot overturn the will, I am ordering that Thornfield House be sold, with the proceeds divided equally between Miss Thornfield and Mrs. Ashford, after the settlement of all debts and the fulfilment of the provisions made for staff and tenants. This division reflects both the legal validity of the will and the equitable claims created by promises made and services rendered. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Beatrice's face went white, then red, then white again. Her husband began to protest, but the judge had already dismissed us with a final strike of his gavel. I walked out of the courtroom into autumn air that tasted like smoke and possibility. My solicitor was already discussing the practical arrangements, the appraisers who would need to be engaged, the timeline for the sale. But I was not listening. I was thinking about the house where I had lived for 18 years, the rooms I had known better than my own reflection, and the strange relief of watching it slip from both our hands. Thornfield House sold in December to a manufacturer from Manchester who wanted a country estate and cared nothing for the history of disappointed women and broken promises. I attended the final auction, watched strangers examine my mother's roses and my uncle's library, and felt nothing but the clean emptiness of endings that clarify. My share of the proceeds came to £8,000, enough to purchase a house of my own in Bath and live modestly on the income from investments. Beatrice received the same amount and moved with her husband to London, where they rented a house in a fashionable square, and no one knew or cared about Thornfield or the scandal that had forced its sale. I never saw her again. I heard, years later, that her husband had made unfortunate investments and that she had been forced to take lodgers. But by then, I had stopped following the stories of people who had tried to inherit my life. I am 43 now, 20 years distant from the morning when the will was read, and I learned the difference between what is promised and what is given. I live in a house that is entirely mine, with a garden I planted and servants I chose, and no one who can take any of it simply by claiming a man's signature made them worthy. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, when the light falls a certain way, I remember Thornfield. Not with longing, but with the cool assessment of someone who has learned that what you lose by force can matter less than what you claim by will. I did not get the inheritance my mother wanted for me, but I got something better. I got the knowledge that silence is a choice, not a requirement. That justice delayed until you demand it is still justice. That the house you build for yourself, with your own hands and your own money, will always be more truly yours than anything you are expected to inherit with gratitude. And I learned that revenge is not always about taking back what was stolen. Sometimes it is simply refusing to pretend the theft never occurred.